In the most recent PTR patch note update and the PTR build that you can play right now, the Diablo team apparently decided to make an item that deletes immunities. We are talking about the first day into the PTR. A lot of this can change based off of feedback, but let me tell you what we got to in our testing, what we can say for sure, and then let's talk about the actual impact that these new Sunder charms are going to have on the meta walking into Season 2, Patch 2.5. A Sunder charm is a unique grand charm, and it has a new keyword called Sunder. When a minion is sundered, it means that if they were immune to that damage type, they now have 95 resistance. So in the case of Flame Rift, if I were to approach a fire immune monster, they will instead have 95 resistance instead of being immune. Things that we know, it doesn't matter how much resistance the monster had to start, it doesn't matter whether or not it's a champion or a unique or a boss, none of that matters. The Sunder effect is the first effect that will apply to a monster. So this is going to apply before Conviction Aura and before lower resistance when we're talking about the elemental damage types. And that has a massive impact on how those stats work now. The flip side of these charms is that they are going to have minus resistance equal to the damage type that they nullify. So Flame Rift is going to sunder fire immunes, and you're going to have negative 75 fire res while you have this equipped. Taking a look at our Sorceress, we have 14 fire res right now. I put on this charm and I'm down to negative 61. The same is said for Cold Rupture for cold, Crack of the Heavens, which is definitely my favorite named one, for lightning resistance, Rotting Fissure for poison, Bone Break for physical, as well as Black Cleft for magic. While the primary elements will reduce your resistances by 75, the physical damage one only decreases your PDR by 25, and the magic damage one only reduces it by 50. Now this is because there's a hard cap on PDR up to 50%, and it's much harder to stack PDR than any of the other resistances. Unless of course you're talking about magic, where there's literally only one item in the game that gives percentage magic resistance, and that's a safety crafted shield. Things that you need to know is that you can have multiple of these charms equipped simultaneously, and you can actually have multiple of the same charm applied at the same time. If you were a multi-elemental build, say you were cold and fire, if you were to have both of those charms in your inventory, while you are getting hit with a total of minus 150 resistances, monsters who are cold immune and monsters who are fire immune now will only have 95 res before anything else applies to them, so you'd be able to deal damage to any monster in the game, regardless of the rest of the gear that you're wearing. Also keep in mind that wearing multiple of the same charm actually doesn't do anything. Since this doesn't reduce monster resistances, but instead just replaces their current number with a new value if they are immune, the only thing that happens if you put on multiple of the same charm is that you get more and more stacking negative resistance. And now let's talk about what these charms actually apply to. And the answer is only the character wearing it. It doesn't apply to any of the members in your party. It doesn't apply for your mercenary or your summons. It doesn't apply for assassin traps. It doesn't even apply for Sorceress's Hydra. This only changes the monster's effective resistance for the person with the charm equipped. Now let's talk about the downstream ramifications of a charm that says monsters are no longer immune to you. Previously in D2, if a monster was immune to any source of damage, effects which would reduce that are only 1/5 effective. So if I had a monster that was immune to fire and I applied Conviction Aura here, I wouldn't actually reduce the resistances by 30 like the skill says, I would actually reduce the resistances by 6 because that's 1/5 of 30. And then even if a monster was now broken, meaning they had less than 100 resistance, any other sources like lower resistance would still only be 1/5 effective. Now with these charms setting the monster to 95 resistances, and after we have tested it, effects like Conviction Aura and lower resistance are 100% effective on that target. So if you have a max level conviction minus 150 res, and you have a charm reducing the monster's resistance to 95, they will end up at minus 55 resistance after your Conviction Aura, whereas previously, or if the logic stayed the same, they would have only have ended up at 65 resistance. This makes builds that have access to different curses or effects which reduce resistances to become incredibly powerful in comparison to how they previously were, when auras like Conviction from Infinity or lower res would only barely break those resistances. Oh, and then on top of that, things like Cold Mastery, the Sorceress skill, which gives minus enemy resistance for your Sorceress only, means that with this charm and enough points in that skill, every monster will be at the maximum negative cap of minus 100 cold res for your character. That means you wouldn't even need Infinity on her at all to increase the cold damage that you're able to do to a target. Now, how do you get your hands on a Sunder charm? Well, they're only going to be dropping from Terror Zone monsters, and they only drop from elite Terror Zone monsters. So killing random minions walking around isn't going to net you a charm. You have to kill either champions, uniques, super uniques like Eldritch when the Frigid Highlands becomes terrorized, and bosses. So anytime that Indariel, Duriel, Mephisto, Diablo, or Baal are terrorized because their areas are terrorized, they will be able to drop the charms as well. Now, without knowing anything about the rarity of the charms, even if we just say they're equal to a Geed's charm in rarity, the fact that you can only get them from elite monsters in terror zones, and on top of that, you may not even get the one that you want. There are now 7 unique grand charms that can drop in the game. These are going to be pretty rare. And while that might sound kind of scary, the cool part is that since it only drops from elite monsters, you don't need to be able to farm terror zones on a high player count to have a chance of dropping this. Elite monsters are always going to drop an item in the game, and all you need to worry about is having enough magic find so that it will roll as unique. So you're actually able to go through and just farm elite packs on players 1 until you get lucky and hit a charm. What I saw a lot in chat today was people having concerns about relative charms being of different value to different builds, and the fact that perhaps the Cold Sorceress is just going to run away with the game now that she doesn't need Infinity anymore. The next part is going to get a little bit numbers heavy, but I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible just so you can have a better understanding of what the end game looks like when you have one of these charms in your inventory. To be able to compare some endgame builds, some builds that have always defined the meta, and these charms are probably going to be the most impactful on, I want to look at the endgame Blizzard Sorceress, an endgame Lightning Sorceress, and an endgame Fireball Meteor Sword. So let's start with Blizzard. Because Cold Sorceresses have always had access to Cold Mastery, anytime they were attacking a monster that was not immune to their damage, that monster should be at negative 100 resistance. When a monster is at negative 100 resistance, you can literally just take your sheet value damage and multiply it by 2, and that's how much damage you're going to do to them, because you're doing true damage to that target. So on the high end here, an Ice Blast would be doing 20,000 damage, and Blizzard would be doing 32,000 damage per shard that hit the target. Now, what the Blizzard Sorc has gained is the ability to farm anywhere. Since you're never going to hit an immunity, the Blizzard Sorc can now literally farm everywhere. The caveat here, though, is that because these charms exist, that is equally true for every single build in the game. You will never hit an immunity as long as you have the charm equipped, so every build has gained access to every farming area. The thing that's funny about the Blizzard Sorceress is that since she already had Cold Mastery and she was always doing true damage, Infinity would break some immunes, but in reality, Infinity is just a really good weapon for your mercenary to have to do single target damage as well as boss damage, and that it also increases the effectiveness of your static field because that Conviction will lower lightning resistance. So the endgame Blizzard Sorceress actually hasn't become stronger, and technically speaking, she's actually become weaker. Since you're losing a skiller charm, you're literally losing damage, and you now have to deal with the minus 75 cold resistance on your build. While she actually hasn't gained an increase in damage against any monster types, she just no longer faces immunities. But again, that's the same across the board. Looking at the Lightning Sorceress, the benefit of Lightning Sorc was that Conviction Aura from Infinity would break most lightning immunes in the game. So while she doesn't do as much damage as the Blizzard Sorc to start off, in the late game, she could almost literally farm everywhere, whereas the Blizzard Sorceress was cut off from some spots. The thing here, though, is because immune monsters were only 1/5 effective from Infinity, when a monster had 100 resistance, Infinity would only break them down to 83. And that's because 85 minus res from Infinity divided by 5 gets you 17. 100 minus 17 is 83. That's why a gear like Griffin's Eye was so powerful, because the minus enemy resistance from this applies at 100% efficiency if the monster is not immune. So the monster goes from being 83 resistant to lightning damage down to 58. So let's just look at what the current damage a lightning sorceress does against a single target and how the game currently works. Let's say the lightning here is doing 40,000 damage, just to make it simple. If we were attacking a target that was 100% immune, and then our conviction aura reduced it down to 83, and then our griffins reduced that down to 58. That means I'm doing 42% of that damage, so I multiply this by 0.42. So against immune monsters, even though the lightning sorceress can kind of farm anywhere with infinity, she would only be doing 16,800 damage as opposed to the 40,000 damage top end. But now let's talk about what happens with these charms. Since the charm will first reduce the monster to 95 resistance, the infinity is 100% effective. That means that after the minus 85, the monster will only have 10 resistance left. Then on top of that, Griffin's Eye is going to reduce it by an additional 25. That means that this monster will have minus 15 resistance. So not only am I going to do 100% damage, I'm actually going to do extra damage because they take increased lightning damage. So I take that same number, that 40,000, and I'm going to multiply that by my 1.15, which is minus 15 enemy res. And now my lightning is doing 46,000 damage per cast for top end damage. So this charm, which is not increasing the damage output of a blizzard sorceress in the end game, is actively increasing the damage potential for a lightning sword. And if my one lightning is doing 46,000 damage top end to a bunch of targets, starting to sound pretty similar to 32,000 AoE damage from Blizzard. But let's go look at Meteor, where it gets even crazier. Fire builds were kind of the in-between between lightning and cold. Infinity doesn't break nearly as many fire immunes as it does lightning immunes, but it breaks a lot more immunities than for cold. On top of that, the raw damage from fire is typically more consistent than lightning, while also being higher than cold. If we look at this character guide here, we have minus 15 from Flickering Flame, another Facet in Ormus, we're up to 20, one in Ashutus, we're up to 25, and then Phoenix with 28. That brings us up to a total of minus 53 enemy res. So let's look at the math. If we used to only have Infinity, and let's say we have another 100 immune fire resistant monster, Infinity is going to reduce it down to 83, and then our minus 53 from our gear, it's going to bring him down to 30 res. So let's look at Fireball. If the monster has 30 resistance, that means that we're only doing 70% of our total damage. So against a monster that was previously immune, broken by Infinity, we're doing 14,000 damage. Now let's look at it with the new charm in place. So the charm's going to bring them down to 95, Conviction will bring them down to 10, and then minus 53 will bring them down to negative 43 resistance. So our 20,000 damage Fireball is going to be increased by 1.43, which is that negative 43 resistance. Now we're doing 28,000 damage per Fireball. The number gets even more gross when you look at Meteor. So first, Meteor with its 43,000 damage was only doing 70% of it. So let's look at 0.7. So it's only doing 30,000 damage. But now, since it's going to be doing 1.43 times damage, it's doing 61,000 damage in an area. So for fire builds, the change with this charm on an endgame build is more than doubling your damage output in comparison to how it used to work in the game, whereas the cold build actually isn't gaining any additional damage. Now here's the other side to it though. Again, depending on rarity of these charms, when you get the charm is going to impact the early games, like the early late game, when you are before you have your Infinity, but you're trying to farm in more dangerous and higher value areas. These charms are going to equally allow any build to go into any of the new Terror Zones and farm, or anywhere in farm since you won't hit immunities. Certain builds and their ability to stack gear are definitely going to have a slightly better time with it. Now, the other thing that I also wanted to talk about was a physical build. So looking at something like the Boazon, I know a lot of people were saying that the physical charm doesn't do as much. You don't have things like Conviction. Elemental builds are typically more powerful. They're easier. Physical damage builds are getting shafted. But I wanted to point out what the current lived experience of the physical damage build is and what it's going to look like after that. So against any random target with no resistances, this particular multi-shot Boazon is doing 7 to 7,700 damage. So let's just say 7,700 is the top end damage. We'll call it at that. When you hit a physical immune in the game, they're almost always only 100% immune. So any minus res effect in the game, like Grim Ward, Decrepify, and Amplify damage, is going to break that resistance. But let's look at amplified damage, something that you would typically get from Atmos Scarab, an amulet that you could equip so that when you attack, you have a chance of applying that amp damage and breaking those immunities. If a monster had 100% resistance and you apply minus 100% from amplified damage, it's only 1/5 effective, and that brings them down to 80% resistant. So if we take our 7,700 damage here from our multi-shot, and we're only doing 20% of our total damage because the monster has 80% resistance, we're only doing 1,500 top-end damage per shot. And this is if you completely ignore critting as well. If the charm first reduces the monster to 95 resistance, and then my amplified damage is 100% effective, that means the monster is being reduced down to -5 resistance. So let's look at that number. Multiply this by our 1.05, and now any immune monster that we are fighting, we go from doing only 1,500 top-end damage to 8,000 top-end damage. The other benefit that I don't think people are necessarily honing in on here is that builds like this would most typically max out something like Magic Arrow, because you needed some way of being able to deal damage until your amplified damage procs, Reaper's Toll applies Decrepify, whatever means you had of applying those types of curses. So you'd be converting 53% of your damage over to magic and then applying that to the monster, waiting for your Atmas or whatever to proc. Now you don't need that because you are able to attack them with your much stronger physical damage because they cannot be immune to you. And then once your amplified damage or Decrepify procs, it is even stronger. Now you can take these 20 points and put them elsewhere. These points are going to open up across a lot of different builds because you're not forced to hybridize to be able to farm in different areas now that these charms exist. Now, here are the key problems with the charms that I see right now that I do think need to be addressed before we can move forward and everybody having a legitimate equal playing field walking into terror zones. First off, again, these charms do not apply to your minions. They don't apply to your mercenary. They don't apply to summons. So builds like Summon Druid or Elemental Skeleton Necromancer and Trapsin are currently getting shafted. These charms literally do not affect them in any way, shape, or form. And if the entire point of the addition of these was to make it so that terror zones are now approachable for every type of build, it's currently failing at that. Secondly, the physical damage one I still believe is a little bit too steep. You're able to more easily stack 3 to 4 times as much resistances for any of the primary resistances as you are for physical damage reduction. And then lastly, for the magic charm. Now, what they have succeeded at was buffing every build around the Hammered In, because realistically, other than Wave 2 in Bale's Throne Room, the Hammered In isn't really gaining anything by running one of these charms, and I think you would literally just keep it in your cube until Wave 2 spawned, take it out, kill everything, and then put it away. But what that does mean is that the other magic damage builds whose only sin is that they share a damage type with the Hammered Ins are also not getting buffed in any way. So your Berserk Barbarian, if you really just like Magic Arrow Amazon, and most notably Bone Spear Necromancer, are gaining almost nothing from this charm. I would even go so far as to say the magic damage charm should sunder monsters down to something like 75% or even 50% resistance. And sure, I guess that empowers Hammered-Ins in some way, but at least a Bone Spear Necromancer, who is typically waiting to kill monsters around a magic immune, be able to kill them with Corpse Explosion, will be able to stack some damage on them on lower player count and at least start to butter them up a little bit before that Corpse Explosion comes down, so that when you're farming, you don't feel like you've been completely left out of the Sundered Charm Terror Zone experience just because you wanted to roll Bone Spear. But that is a lot. Again, for right now, this is what we know about how they work. This could change according to feedback, and it could just change based off of what the devs think about the PTR in general. So please get out there, play the PTR if you can, test it, and give your feedback. It's so important that we get this right walking into patch 2.5, because there's a lot of room for error here, and there's a chance that some builds just get left by the wayside while everybody else gets to enjoy the new hotness. Let me know what you think, what builds you're really excited to play now that you're going to be able to ignore immunities in every zone that you walk into, and what type of builds you think are really going to shine, especially builds that could potentially use multiple of these charms. I'm thinking a martial arts assassin with one of each elemental charm just walking around and Phoenix striking everything into oblivion. That sounds super rad to me. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like on this, and leaving a comment. It would mean so much to me. Thank you so much to everybody who has done it already. Honestly, my heart overfills with joy. Thank you very much. Again, thank you so much for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.